The nation had been at war for 2 decades. Neither victory nor defeat seemed imminent. But the insurgency campaign initiated and supported by a regional competitor was getting worse. The citizens and allies were exhausted. But how to end this seemingly endless war? Although this could describe recent events, it's the situation Sparta found itself in near the end of the Peloponnesian War more than 2,400 years ago. Welcome to the Ancient Art of Modern Warfare. I'm Chris Mayer, retired U.S. Cavalry Officer and former instructor for the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College and the Naval War College. This is the second in a series about ending war. My intent is to explain, once war has started, the necessary steps to move forward towards peace. Ending a war is not as easy as it might sound. Now, some might say that we could have peace if one side would just lay down its arms, or, as Pope Francis recently and unfortunately suggested, raise the white flag. After all, as Clausewitz wrote, the invader always wants peace. All it takes is for the defender to lay down his arms. The invader would much prefer to take your country unopposed. Clausewitz's model was Napoleon, but it could just as readily apply to Vladimir Putin. The point is that in any war, just as both sides must agree to fight, to end a war, both sides must be willing to stop fighting. If one side lays down its arms while the other side is still fighting, then the side choosing peace will have left its population open to murder, wanton destruction, or worse. Let's look at a scenario where one side, I'll call this country X, is not yet defeated but realizes it can't achieve its war aims and is only delaying the inevitable destruction of its remaining military capacity along with continued or accelerated civilian casualties. In other words, it faces the conditions where just war theory demands to stop fighting. Presuming the leader of country X is sane, the challenge is to find a way to stop fighting without making conditions even worse for your people or that of an ally. The rational solution is to negotiate terms while X still has credible means to resist, while its opponent does not yet know the cost it may yet pay for victory. Preferably, negotiations use what is called the good offices of a third party. This third party could be a country. The United States filled this role in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 and in the negotiations leading to the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty of 1979. Good offices could also come from a multinational organization, such as the Economic Community of West African States, which performed this role ending the Liberian Civil War in 2003. To work, each side must trust this interlocutor to be fair, if not impartial. It also means that the other side, which I will call country Y, must also believe that war termination is in its own best interests. If Y has not yet achieved its objectives in fighting the war but thinks these are still within reach, then it will probably choose to continue fighting. Country X asking to negotiate peace might even encourage Y to believe that military victory is imminent. And that's the situation that Sparta found itself in when it asked for peace with Athens. Without that trusted third party, the Athenians, sensing Spartan defeat and carried away with democratic passion, refused. Where a third party is mediating, that party might be able to use its good offices to convince country Y that it can achieve its war aims in peace negotiations, or to accept some lesser war aims, or that the international consequences of continuing to fight are not worth the perceived gain, or the moment of perceived victory may pass. And that is what happened with Athens, which shortly thereafter found the tables turned, isolated, besieged, starving, and finally surrendering to Sparta. Peace negotiations could include an armistice or ceasefire, where the warring parties decide to stop fighting, at least while the negotiations are underway, or the negotiations could take place without a ceasefire. The advantage of a ceasefire or armistice is that the death and destruction are ended, at least for the moment. Recent examples include Operation Desert Storm and the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. The disadvantage to a ceasefire is that either or both sides can use that pause to rest, refit, rearm, and prepare to resume fighting. Sadly, this ceasefire to enable future fighting has been common in the post-World War II environment. The advantage in not having a ceasefire is that one side may truly be ready for peace when it's agreed, either by having achieved its war aims or becoming so exhausted that neither side is willing or able to continue fighting. And that is what happened in Liberia. The disadvantage, of course, is that the death and destruction continue. Ideally, search for a mediator should not wait until the defeat by one side or the other is inevitable. It should begin at the very opening of hostilities, beginning the conflict with the end in mind. Just because you're shooting at one another doesn't mean you should stop talking to one another. After all, it's a political outcome each side is seeking. Military action is just a means to that end. In 1973, the Egyptian political objective was to control and reopen the Suez Canal. The military objective was to create conditions that would drive third-party intervention once Egypt was across the canal. Again, the requirements for this process are that both sides are willing to stop fighting and that they can find a trusted third party to provide the good offices necessary to negotiate a peace. It helps when the political objectives of the war are known by both parties, so that each side knows what the other expects of the war. When this is unknown, then the fighting is likely to continue far beyond reason, with each anticipating the worst from any peace. Unfortunately, it seems that logic in the peace process is notable for its absence. The requirement for unconditional surrender is a classic example of this irrationality. It is one thing to demand an unconditional surrender of military units fighting in the field, as each should be able to expect that an unconditional surrender is still conditioned by the laws and customs of war. It is another matter at the strategic level, where the surrendering nation has no idea what will be expected of it by the victor, or whether it and its people will survive at all. In World War II, the demand for unconditional surrender probably caused the war to last a year or so longer than it did. At that time, President Roosevelt said that unconditional surrender would not entail the destruction of the populations of the Axis powers, but rather the destruction of the philosophies in those countries, which are based on conquest and the subjugation of other people. This condition of unconditional surrender might have opened a way to end the war with the German General Staff, but it certainly wasn't acceptable to the Nazi leadership. Furthermore, no one expected constraint in unconditional surrender to the Soviet Union. As a result, the fighting continued. To wrap up, deciding to end a war is easier than ending the war. Just like going to war, ending the war requires agreement from both sides, and preferably a third party trusted by each. Laying down your arms or cutting and running without an agreement by the other side to stop fighting or on what comes next has led to even more death and destruction. Not knowing what the opposing side wants from ending the war can lead to desperation on the part of a country facing probable defeat, aware that as long as they remain undefeated, there is still a possibility, although remote, that they may yet prevail. This, too, leads to continued death and destruction. The time to think about these things is not when defeat or victory is imminent, but before the first shot is fired.